See, it says we're live. I just want to double check. I'm going to go up to my YouTube. Yep, there you go. Share it to my Facebook so we can get this out there. There you go. Okay, so there's 4 viewers. Let's go ahead and start. Welcome to Confident Faith, where we're having a nice discussion with Eric Hernandez on apologetics and the soul. And I'm gonna go ahead and let Eric introduce himself before we get started. And like I was telling Eric, I'll let him do it. I don't want to, butcher it. Let him keep his respect. So Eric, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you. And like I said, I'd probably butcher it myself. My name is Eric Hernandez. I am the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses everything from I organize 3 annual, what we call the unapologetic evangelism conferences, and also just go to churches and do trainings on apologetics and evangelism, do online debates and discussions, and get the privilege of being able to talk to young, brilliant guys like yourself. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yep. Thank you for coming on. So like I was talking with you earlier, before we get any deeper on talking about the soul, I feel like it's good for us to discuss, or allow you to discuss first, why it even matters, or why do we even take the time to discuss stuff like the soul? Why don't we just, copy and paste the Bible verse about the soul on our Facebook and leave it at that? Why is it even worth taking the time to, engage methodically and systematically about the soul?
Yeah, great question. So just why apologetics in general, and why not just, like you said, just cite a verse and whatnot? Yeah. Many reasons. I'd say first and foremost, because the Bible commands us to give an answer. Of course, those familiar with apologetics know the verse in 1 Peter 3:15, which says, to be ready to give an answer or defense. That Greek word is apologia, which literally means defense, to anyone who asks you for the hope that is in you. So here we have a commandment from the Bible to all believers to engage in what is essentially the discipline and task of apologetics. Now, that being said, when we have questions from people, a Bible and verse citation is not always sufficient. Now, for the listeners, don't hear me saying something I'm not saying. I'm not saying that the Bible isn't God's word or anything like that, but I'll put it this way. If someone wants to ask about the Trinity, there's no particular passage and verse that's going to spell out the doctrine of the Trinity, but instead of what we do is we take a systematic approach to what's being taught in Scripture, and we come to conclusions derived from what Scripture is telling us. On top of that, the Bible is not a book of philosophy or theology. Now, that's not to say it doesn't touch in areas of theology or philosophy, but rather it's not meant to teach it. In other words, I like what John Lennox once said: if I wanted to learn calculus, I'm not going to go to the book of Numbers to learn that, right? Because it's not meant to teach calculus. But if it were to touch on mathematical principles, what it says would be true. So the Bible is often underdeterminative explicitly on some issues. What do I mean by that? If I wanted to ask what it meant for God to be omnipresent, there's no particular verse and passage I can point to that's going to lay out a definition of omnipotence or omniscience or omnipresence, much less even use those words in particular. Rather, these are words that we've come to describe God, given the attributes we've learned either through natural theology or from Scripture. So that being said, if someone were to ask me something about the soul, what position do you take? Substance dualism, property dualism, hylomorphism, panpsychism? I would say, well, substance dualism. And they say, oh, and what verse do you have to back that up? Well, there's not going to be a verse in the Bible that's going to say a substance dualism is the accurate view of the nature of man, but rather what I can do is I can take principles from Scripture and, of course, aid that with natural theology and philosophy, and show and provide arguments and reasons for why I would hold to substance dualism. Now, some people may come back and say, okay, but all we need is Scripture. Scripture is the only thing you need to answer these questions. Well, if someone were to say that, I'd ask them what verse and passage is that Scripture written that all we need is Scripture to answer these questions. Of course, there is none. So the very statement itself can't even sustain the very statement it's making. Moreover, when we are talking to people, some of the questions they have are usually going to have a deeper foundation or root system, if you will, to what they're asking. And it's important to not just answer the question, but answer the person that's asking the question, and that can take a variety of approaches and methods. But lots more to be said here. Nevertheless, what I love is in 1 Corinthians in chapters 10, 4, 5, and 6, chapter 10, verse 4, 5, and 6, it talks about spiritual warfare. And it says that the purpose of spiritual warfare, it lays out that first, spiritual warfare is not something that we engage in physically, but it's something spiritual. And then it says that the nature of spiritual warfare is to tear down strongholds. Well, of course, the next question would be, well, what's a stronghold? Well, thankfully, the Bible defines it in the next verse. And it says that a stronghold are things like ideas, thoughts, beliefs, ideologies, philosophies that go against the knowledge of God. So, biblically speaking, within spiritual warfare, according to this passage, our job is to tear down and destroy these strongholds, which are defined as arguments, thoughts, beliefs, ideologies that go against the knowledge of God. Well, this is precisely the task of apologetics. It's responding to people's objections or arguments against God and providing reasons for why we believe what we do. So, that being said, I remember one time I was talking to somebody, and I think it was a pastor, and I think we were just kind of having a brief discussion. And of course, I started talking about apologetics, and he said, well, you know what? He said, I think some of this stuff, it's too deep for the average person. And then he said, and you don't want to go too deep, because if you go too deep, people will drown. And I kind of smirked, and I said, well, that's why as ministers of the gospel, we teach them how to swim. Right? We don't avoid, quote, deep topics because people are going to drown. Instead, we teach people how to swim. That's what Scripture calls us to do as ministers of the gospel. I've also had other people say, well, my students or my youth group, they don't ask these deep questions. And depending on how many prayers I've said that day, if someone says that to me, that's going to depend on how I respond. But I said, well, with all due respect, I can assure you they have questions. But if they're not approaching you with these questions, it says more about how much they trust you than it says about the questions they have. I remember growing up in youth group having questions and being told on 2 instances to stop asking questions, or that I was just asking questions to be a contrarian, or just to kind of stir something up, when in reality they were genuine questions that I had concerning Scripture or theology. And I remember thinking to myself, after our youth group services, they would say, invite a friend next week. And I thought to myself, why would I invite a friend, a non-believer, to church when I can't even ask questions in my own church? Why would I feel comfortable inviting someone else? So there's a lot more to be said there, but just to reiterate, 1, it's biblically mandated. 2, some questions are not going to be answered by just a passage and verse citation, and we want to meet people where they're at and answer the questions that they're asking, and even address the underlying presuppositions behind the questions they may have. And of course, it's going to take Scripture, it's going to take a logic, philosophy, it's going to take theology, and it's going to take a holistic approach to this. One last verse I'll say to back this up is the greatest commandment that Christ gave. When they approached him, they said, trying to trap him, they said, what's the greatest commandment? And when I teach this at churches, I like to kind of jokingly ask people, out of all the commandments in the Old Testament, which was the greatest? And I ask, how many commandments are in the Old Testament? And usually someone from the audience shouts 10. And I say, well, close enough. There's 613, but 10 is pretty close. But out of all 613 commandments, he said that the greatest was to love the Lord God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Now, what he's essentially getting at here again, to try and be brief is, see, I'll put it this way. I think the modern day church does a great job of loving God with our heart, which was indicative of something like the emotions. You know, we get emotional when we pray, we cry at the altar, we lift our hands during worship, and that's great. That is part of fulfilling the greatest commandment. And then there's loving God with your strength, which encompasses your servitude towards God. We volunteer at the bake sales, we pull out chairs for the youth service. But then there's loving God with the mind. And if I can be frank here, I think here is an area where the modern day 21st century American church has really dropped the ball. And what people fail to realize is that whether you're lifting your hands in worship or lifting a difficult book to read, both are acts of fulfilling the greatest commandment and loving God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength. So it's a holistic approach. Now, I'm not saying we should overemphasize the intellectual over something like the emotional, but I'm saying we should take a holistic approach to it. And given the fact that I think that the modern church has had a history of overemphasizing emotion over the mind, we need to pick up the slack and make up for that. And we need to train our congregation, our young people, to love God with the mind, and to know that our salvation is not dependent or grounded on some emotional high or experience we once had at something like youth camp, but is grounded in the fact and reality that God exists and Christ was raised from the dead. When I begin to understand that my faith is grounded in that and not in me, in my emotions or feelings, I begin to take my faith more seriously. I begin to realize that that Christianity does not stand or fall on the basis of who I am or what kind of husband or person I am. Now, those things are important, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, the truth or falsity of Christianity lies in the fact and question of whether or not God exists and God rose Jesus from the dead. If those things are true, Christianity is true no matter what. So I think this is where the task of apologetics and equipping people comes into play, which, of course, goes hand in hand with something like evangelism and discipleship.
Okay. Now, before we go any further, talking about going into details on the soul, I wanted to just ask why you think it is that those who may be searching for answers to certain questions, why you think it is that it's often met with a response that's not biblical. You know, like, oh, you shouldn't be asking questions, or, you know, if you just read the Bible, you come to the right conclusion. Now, I don't want you to get in trouble and name any, like, you know, names. You know, this church was all. I just want you to explain why you think it is that that's the response to people with genuine questions.
Yeah, I'll give the names in the after show where people have to pay to get in, but no, I'm joking. Yeah, great question. And I don't know if I can give just one answer, but I think the root of responses such as that stems from something like ignorance or perhaps even intimidation of the questions being asked. You know, I find that people have a big misunderstanding of what faith is, and that word is thrown around far too often in the wrong way. Some Christians tend to think that faith is something that God just zaps you with, or something that you just squeeze your fist really tight and pray for, and God's going to give it to you. But biblically speaking, faith is a Greek word pistis, which means a trust or confidence. And what people fail to realize is that in order to have trust or confidence in something, I have to first have knowledge about the thing that I'm being asked to trust or confide in. In other words, in order to trust in, I have to first know that. So the typical example that's given is, before I can trust in a chair, I have to first I have to first know that the chair is made of durable material. Before I can trust in the chair to support me, I have to first know that it has 4 stable legs and so forth. So the more I know about the chair, the more trust and confidence I can put into it. Same thing when I got married. Before I dropped on one knee and proposed to my wife, I had to have sufficient evidence and reasons to say I can put my trust in this woman to be my wife, my soulmate, my spouse for the rest of my life. In other words, I didn't just do it from one day to the next. Now, admittedly, it was pretty quickly. I met her in January, and we were married by August of that same year. So within 6 to 7 months, we met, we dated. Within a few months after that, I proposed. That's a whole nother story and testimony in itself. But point is, I had the evidence I needed to go forward with it. In the same way, beating someone over the head with the Bible or telling them to just have more faith would be like going on a blind date and then telling somebody, okay, after the first 10 minutes, do you want to marry this person? Not to say that that can't happen, but the person's going to need maybe another date or two, to find out. Point being simply that in order for us to expect people to trust in God, they have to first know about God and know who he is. In fact, the Bible says, how can they believe? How can they call on someone that they haven't believed in? And even merely believing in God is not enough, because scripture says even the demons believe and tremble. But it's about knowing and having reasons to put my faith and trust in the God of the Bible. Now, again, that can play out in a number of ways, but when people don't understand the relationship between faith and reason, they tend to abuse using the word faith in many ways. Sure, the Bible says that faith is the evidence of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. People take that and think it means faith is something you believe when you have no evidence. So it's actually the exact opposite. Faith is a knowledge-based thing. The word faith is used, I forget how many times in scripture, but then the word knowledge is used so many more times than that. If my wife were to tell me, hey, I'm going to go to the store, and I say, that's fine, be careful. An hour later, I check on her and say, hey, how are things going? You okay? She goes, yeah, I'm still at the store. Now, I don't have evidence before me that she is at the store other than her testimony, other than what she shared with me. In other words, I don't have anything to visually see to, quote, prove to me she's at the store. However, I have enough confidence and trust in her based on my knowledge of what kind of person she is and maybe how long she takes to shop. I can trust and confide in the fact that she is at the store, even when I don't, quote, see the evidence for it. But note, it's based on previous evidence and knowledge. And I think this is exactly why it says in Hosea, I think it's 4:6, that my people perish for lack of knowledge. And then it goes on to say, and because of this, I've kept you from being kings and priests, representatives of me, essentially. So if you need knowledge to have faith, then clearly without knowledge, people perish. And because of that, they're kept from being representatives of God, if you will. Again, lots more to say there. But yeah, I think it's ignorance. And the second thing I'd say is probably also stems from intimidation. I think sometimes another thing a lot of people fail to realize, is that every new day we're growing in our technology and what we're willing to access. When I was growing up and when I was your age, I didn't have all amount of information that we do now. Now, it's not to say the internet wasn't around. I'm not that old, but I remember when I first got the internet and it took like 10 to 15 minutes just to start. So even if I wanted to go look for information, I had to at least wait 10 to 15 minutes and then everything was completely slow. Now my son, who's 3, who is talking, but maybe cannot articulate a fully structured sentence, knows how to use an iPhone relatively well for his age. And yet, again, so many years ago, I had to wait so long just to watch a video to read an article. So I say that to say, youth nowadays in church can literally fact check the youth pastor as he's preaching to see if what he's saying is true. And again, what we fail to realize is, because of this rise in technology, the access to information is so much more than it ever was. And that's not always a good thing, because there's a lot of bad information as well online. And as Christians, we have to be able to give a concise, precise case for whatever it is that we're speaking to. And we can no longer be intellectual lazy because of the climate and culture that we live in. Because of this, again, I think people have learned a lot more, but have also probably fed into some bad information. And then you have them asking their pastors or youth pastors these questions. And these are questions that perhaps the pastors or youth pastors have never thought of. And granted, the student may have never thought of them either, but they came across it online. And because the minister that they're asking can't answer the question, well, they just say something like, well, it's all about faith, as a kind of cop-out to say, I don't know how to answer your question, but stop asking questions because you're making me look bad.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so the reason I was wanting to ask that was just to give maybe for the audience who's listening, maybe if they had questions, to know that it's something that, or if you have doubts, it's something that you can work through. and it's not something that you and also just because you don't understand doesn't mean that there's not any justification, but also that there's a way to work through it. And to give an example, me and Eric are going to discuss the soul coming up in just a few minutes. So Eric, so how did you first? Let's see if you're on. I want to make sure you could hear the question. I don't want to.
Yeah, I'm on. Sorry, I heard a lot of.
Problem.
I heard something hitting the window, and it's apparently hailing at my house. I didn't know it was going to hail today. I didn't even know it was going to rain, but
yeah, it was really windy today. Like, I live in Kansas. It was really windy. I figured there's a storm brewing down there. I knew in Oklahoma they were getting some. So yeah, so I wanted to ask how you first started gaining interest in the soul, or why you even started looking into the soul. I feel like just giving a little bit of background on how you got interested would be a great help to the audience before we get any deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. So this goes into even just how I got into apologetics in general. Basically, freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class, and I really enjoyed it because here was like almost for the first time a place where I was encouraged to ask questions, and there was dialogue was encouraged. But what really struck me was in my first week of this class. I remember in youth group, my youth pastor said something like, if anyone ever asks you to prove to them that God exists, all you have to do is simply ask them to prove to you that he doesn't exist. And I thought, well, wow, that's brilliant. I'm gonna put this in my back pocket and use it anytime I need it. Well, first week in philosophy class, my professor says that this first week we're going to talk about something called the burden of proof. And he said the burden of proof is basically the notion that if you make a truth claim, you then bear the burden to prove the thing that you're claiming is true. Then he said, as a random example, which I later found out was not a random example because he was an atheist, but he said, as a random example, if you're a Christian here today and you claim that God exists, and if someone asks you to prove to them that God exists, you cannot shift the burden of proof and ask them to prove to you that he doesn't, because given the fact that you made the claim, you bear the burden. And when he said that, I kind of felt like my house of cards just collapsed. And I thought, well, there goes that. But I was intrigued. And call me crazy, but I grew up and my parents taught me that all truth is God's truth. And if that was the case, then I shouldn't be afraid to learn new things, because if all truth is God's truth, and no matter what I learn, it's not going to contradict who God is. So with that mindset, it came time to sign up for my next semester of classes, and I was really wanting to take another class in philosophy. And everyone warned me that if I was going to take another class, not to take Professor Pena's class, because he was an atheist philosophy professor who was very well known on campus for being antagonistic and condescending to Christians. And my friends told me, if you take his class, you could very well lose your faith. Now, this excited me, and I thought, well, where can I sign up? Not because I wanted to lose my faith, of course, but because I knew that in my mind, if Christianity was true, I needed to know why. But at the same time, if Christianity was false, I still wanted to know why, and maybe this guy was the one for the job. Nevertheless, the pivotal moment in class, or the pivotal day in class for me, was when he walks in and he sits at the front of his desk like he usually does. And he pulls out and he pretends to pull out like an antidepressant pill from his pocket. And he says, now, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And according to Christianity, this is where your emotions and your mood and your will reside. And it's allegedly something non-physical. And it's because of the soul that we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have passed away. He says, but here's an antidepressant pill, which is something physical. Now, if I took this, it would have the power to change the states and moods and emotions and feelings of my allegedly immaterial soul. But if the soul is not physical, then how is it that something tiny and physical, how can this change the immaterial states of my soul? Because every time we look at the brain, we just see neurons firing. And every time Scientists have examined the body. All we find are the base elements of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but you never find anything like a soul. Why is that? And he said, well, the answer is simple, and I'll tell you. It's because there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no God, there is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body, and we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives. And it was basically like, well, class dismissed. Now, this really troubled me because as a freshman in college, not only had I never met anyone that didn't believe in the soul, I had never heard an objection raised against it. And what really troubled me was up until this point in my life, I had heard a lot of people that gave complaints against Christianity, but really that's all they were complaints. Something like, well, God in the Old Testament said or did this, or, well, Christians are hypocrites. Even if all those things were true, that wouldn't prove God didn't exist or that Christianity was false. But here for the first time, I heard an objection that if true, would mean Christianity was false. Now, why do I say that? Well, Paul says that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we should be felt sorry for. We should be pitied amongst all men, and says basically that if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christianity is false. Well, by the same line of logic, if there's no soul, I would argue there can be no resurrection, and thus Christianity would be false. So I had a choice, and basically, do I try and answer this, or do I just sweep it under the rug and just kind of forget about it? Well, because of my character, I'm the kind of person that if I have a question, I want to find out the answer. And of course, how much more so with a question that could, depending on the answer, either prove or disprove the very thing I've built my life on, that we believe, that we devote our lives to. So long story short, it was actually because of him that I began to really study much more in depth about philosophy. And I learned about apologetics. I learned about philosophy before I learned apologetics. Learned about philosophy before I learned about apologetics, and then later found out guys like William and Craig. And then when I found JP Moreland's work, who's an expert on the soul, I mean, I just fell in love with the material, and I just, couldn't get enough. Still can't. And in fact, 5 years after I graduated from that community college, again, to try and keep the story brief, I actually got an invitation from a church that I didn't attend, but I knew the youth pastor, and he asked if I'd be willing to debate somebody on the existence of God. And I asked, well, yeah, who is it? And he said, well, this professor from San Jac named Professor Pena. Have you heard of him? So that was really, really interesting and exciting. Sometime after our debate, I approached him and I said, I know you're an atheist, so I don't know how you're going to take this, but I just really want to thank you for allowing God to use you the way he did in my life, because if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. Now, I said it kind of jokingly, but the more I've thought about it, it's if anything, it's really quite sad, because what pushed me into the area of apologetics and specifically into studying the existence of the soul wasn't a pastor, it wasn't a Christian minister, it wasn't one of my peers in youth group. It was two atheist philosophy professors. Because even if God wanted to use a Christian to influence me in this way in my life, he couldn't, because there were none around me that did. There's a verse in scripture that says, if you silence these, or if these don't cry out, the rocks will cry out to me. And for me, these two philosophy professors were like the rocks crying out, because there was no one in my life to speak to me in this way. So yeah, it's something that I not only do, but it's something I've lived through and continue to every day. And I can't tell you how many stories. I mean, I could share tons of stories of either people who were deprived of learning apologetics because of their church or pastor and wasn't a good ending, or people who have benefited and come to Christ because of something like apologetics. And, go figure, it's almost as if God knew what he was talking about when he said, be ready to give an answer, defense. And when he talked about spiritual warfare and tearing down strongholds.
Yeah, that's awesome. So before we go into I keep on saying this, but I feel like we should get into the meat of the video or the live stream. So how would you define the soul, or how would you describe the soul before we go any further, so we know what we're talking about when we say the soul?
Yeah, great question. So here's a definition we can work with, is that the soul is an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. Now, to kind of simplify that, what is the soul? The soul is the self, or the conscious subject. When I use the word I'm referring to something. It's what we call an indexical word. So words like here or there are indexical words which reference, or they have a reference point. So when I say I'm talking about me, the self. But of course, the question is, what am I? Well, the two major options are I am either just a body, or I am a soul that has a body. So I'm what you would call a substance dualist. To try to not go too technical into it, we could say it's basically the view that I am a soul that has a body. I don't have a soul, but rather I am a soul, and without a soul, a body is just a corpse. But of course, I've actually recently changed my position on this, because I actually now believe I do have a soul, and it's actually an orange Kia Soul, and it's parked in my driveway. And as I'm sure you know, I bought that car just so I can make this joke, and it's been worth every penny. You could say it's a rich joke, if you will. Sorry, dad jokes here.
Yeah, dad jokes. Yeah,
it's the most expensive joke I've ever made, but I love it. So the soul is you, the self. So when I say the word I'm not referring to my body or my brain. I'm referring to me, the soul that has a body. Yeah.
Okay. So I know that the main competing view to substance dualism, because you would consider yourself a substance dualist, correct? And that's what that is. Substance dualists are I am a soul who has a body, right?
Yeah, it can be said that way.
Yeah. And I know that the competing view, or the biggest competing view, is physicalism. So would you go ahead and explain what physicalism is?
Yeah, so physicalism is a view that human beings are purely physical objects, which is to say that all the properties and parts that exist to a human being are going to be purely physical. That is what's called strict physicalism. To keep it simple, we'll just call it physicalism. So anything about me can be explained and investigated with something physical. So, for example, like what my professor was saying, he was essentially trying to argue that because a physical pill can affect my emotions and moods, he's alleging that it must follow that consciousness and the soul must be something physical, given that something physical can change those effects. So he would have been what you would call a physicalist. Consciousness and the soul, there is nothing like that, and anything that we're going to describe about the person is going to be reducible or identical to something physical. So yeah, that would be the quickest way to answer that.
Okay. So before I was going to say, what problems do you see with physicalism? But before I want to build a case, I want you to build a case for the existence of a soul. So I know in the past I've posted in certain Facebook discussion groups just to, probe what in certain atheist discussion groups what they were thinking on the soul. And they thought, just because you say soul, you're talking about mysticism, or that there's no evidence at all or science disproves it. And I know that you disagree with that. So first of all, I'd like to ask, is there any justification at all, or is there any justification whenever you say that we have a soul, or are you just borrowing from mysticism?
Yeah. And so, yeah, I would go as far as to say, I think we can be more certain that we have a soul than we can be that we have a body. What's funny is a lot of times skeptics or atheists like to kind of pose it the other way. We know we have a body, but we don't know if we have a soul. Where I would say, no, I know for sure we have a soul, but the body, that's something that could be more questionable. Now, here's what I mean by that. So first of all, when I make a case for the soul, there are two basic points I set out to demonstrate. One, that consciousness is not physical. That is to say, my thoughts, sensations, beliefs, desires, and my volition, which are the 5 states of consciousness, those aren't something physical. So they're not in my brain. They are correlated with brain activity, but they're not identical, which is the same thing as or reducible to something like a physical brain activity. And second, I aim to demonstrate that I am more than a brain and body. In other words, I'm not identical or reducible to it. I am something more than that, namely a soul. Now, going back to what I said about, I'd say that we're more certain that we have a soul than we are that we have a body. Here's why. First, I'd say that consciousness is not physical. How do we know that? For any discussion on the soul, the most important principle to understand is something known as Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. To be brief, we'll just call it Leibniz's law or law of identity. So according to Leibniz's law, if two things in question are the same thing, that is to say they're identical, in philosophy that means the same thing as, then whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other. So for example, your Eric Hernandez and your guest on the show are identical, which means, again, they're the same person. So whatever's true of one is going to be true of the other. Why? Because, well, we're just using two different names of reference to refer to one person, not two. By contrast, if there can be demonstrated that there is something true of one that's not true of the other, then given Leibniz's law, they can't be the same thing, because something that's the same thing as itself is going to share all the same properties. So here's an illustration. Suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid, one labeled chemical X and the other labeled water. But let's say the label with chemical X, it's scratched off. You walk in and you ask yourself, are the two substances within these bottles, are they the same substance? Are they identical? Well, you see that they're both clear fluids, and you think, well, so far I can say that perhaps they are the same substance. But then you pick over the one with the ripped off label and you turn it around and it says caution flammable. And you think, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what this chemical is, I know at the very least it's not water, because water is not flammable and thus they don't share the same properties. Okay. Now with this in mind, if what my professor was saying is true, then if consciousness is identical or reducible to the brain, then whatever is true of the brain is going to be true of the mind, right? But we know that that's really easy to demonstrate that's not the case. How so? I'll give just 3 examples. Take a state of my mind like my thoughts. My thoughts can be true or false, but my neurons firing, which is a state of my brain, aren't true or false. It doesn't even make sense to say, it wouldn't make sense to look at my brain and say, these neurons firing here are true, but these neurons in the left hemisphere, those are false. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is a sensation in my mind, is not 7 inches long. I can give dozens of more examples, but the point simply is that if consciousness exists and all its properties are mental properties, and if all the properties of the brain are physical properties, then consciousness, if it exists, cannot be identical or reducible to something like the brain. Okay, so that being said, anything that's conscious, I would argue, and again, just trying to keep it brief, anything that's conscious is going to have a soul, because you're going to need to ground these immaterial states and properties of the mind in some type of a substance that can contain them, if you will. So if it's conscious, it has a soul. Now, with this in mind, suppose I were to wake up one day. As soon as I wake up and I gain consciousness, I can immediately know which thoughts are mine. But in other words, I can't be mistaken about which thoughts I'm having, but I can be mistaken about what body I have or what part of my body is there. You hear horror urban legend stories of someone waking up in a bathtub full of ice and their kidneys missing, right? So in other words, you can wake up and think your whole body's there, only to open your eyes and realize, oh, I'm actually missing a body or two. Someone stole it from me, a body part or two. You also have interesting things like phantom limb pain, where usually it's with soldiers who have had limbs torn or blown off in war. Well, often, let's say if someone has no legs, a veteran has no legs, maybe in the middle of the night, they may begin to feel leg pain, and yet there's no leg there. In other words, they're mistaken about what parts of the body they actually have, but the pain is real. You can wake up with a numb arm. That's happened to me before, where, my arm went numb and I'm like, I can't feel my hand. So in other words, I can wake up and immediately know which thoughts are mine without question or mistake. And yet I can't always immediately wake up and know which body parts I have or don't have, and I can be mistaken about them. So I would say we're more certain that we have a soul than we are that we have a body. Again, many more examples there, but that's concerning the first point. The second point, that I am more than a brain and body, well, again, that's, I would say, relatively easy to demonstrate. There's various arguments. I typically use 3, but I'll share just one. Let's look at something like the indivisibility of personhood, or let's do identity through change. So if I'm just a physical object, if physicalism is true, then I would be what you would call an aggregate. I am a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, we know that when it comes to the nature of an aggregate, and what's an aggregate? Think of things like watches, cars, or Lego bricks. We know that these purely physical objects, which are a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure, their existence and identity necessarily depends on their parts, which means if you remove or change the parts, you're going to change the thing that it is. So, for example, if I were to take a tricycle, which is by definition, at least at minimum, something with 3 wheels. If I were to take a tricycle and remove just one of the wheels, then metaphysically speaking, we can say that technically a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence. Now, this shows us that when it comes to purely physical objects, they're not going to maintain identity through change of part replacement. You mess with the parts, you're going to change its identity. One more, take a pile of wooden boards. These pile of wooden boards are arranged in such a way that we can say they have the property of being a pile of wooden boards. But if I were to take that same pile, rearrange their structure a little bit, I can make a raft and then say, well, now we have a raft, or make a ladder and say, now we have a ladder. Again, for physical objects, the identity and its existence depends on the parts and structure. Now, here would be the argument in a nutshell. You could say I am either an aggregate, a purely physical object, or an immaterial substance like a soul. Well, I would argue that if I am nothing more than an aggregate, then I'm not going to maintain identity through change or part replacement. But I do maintain identity through change or part replacement. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, to demonstrate this, suppose you were to take something like a crime that somebody committed 10 years ago. Let's say I committed a crime 10 years ago. Now, it's been said that every 7 to 10 years, we change virtually every cell in our body. So suppose I committed a crime 7 to 10 years ago, and then J. Warner Wallace knocks on my door and says, Eric, we now have the evidence to convict you. We know that it was you that committed this crime. Sorry, bud, but I have to take you to jail. Now, imagine if I looked at him and said, but Jay, don't you know we're just purely physical objects? There's no soul. And every 7 to 10 years, we change our body. And since purely physical objects don't maintain identity through change, the person you're looking for isn't me. Go find that guy, but good luck because he doesn't exist. Of course, he's going to laugh probably and then slap the cuffs on me and take me to jail. Why? Because we all intuitively know that persons do maintain identity through change. In other words, if you were to chop off my arms and legs, I'm still me, which shows that my arms and legs weren't necessary to be Eric Hernandez. So Eric Hernandez isn't grounded in having 2 arms and 2 legs. There's something more than that. One more support for this line of argument is actually an argument that atheist philosopher Jaegwon Kim made. Didn't make, but he presented it in his book, Philosophy of Mind. And he basically poses the argument to kind of think about this line of reasoning and says this brain and body did not exist in 2001. However, I did exist in 2001. Therefore, I'm not identical to my brain and body. So that's exactly, the argument. So that would be one of the many arguments I'd say we can use to show that, look, I'm either a purely physical object or a soul. In other words, either physicalism is true or substance dualism is true. Well, if I was just a purely physical object, this would apply to me like identity, not having identity through change. But given that I do have identity through change, then it must follow that I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul.
Yeah. Now, I stated earlier that physicalism is mostly the competing view when it comes to the soul debate, and it seems that anytime you really try to discuss the soul, even if you were to present arguments, you're like, yeah, but how about, like you were saying, the example your professor gave, where if you take a physical pill, it can affect your mood. So to the audience, how would you be able to respond to that? Or where they try to undercut your arguments by saying, yeah, but if I, damage a part of your brain, you might have different mood changes or problems with that. But obviously, we would believe that doesn't just because there's correlations doesn't mean that's what's caused. The correlations are not equal causation. But I want you to go ahead and explain that for the audience so they can understand that if they were to have that brought up.
Yeah. I would just kind of unpack further what you're getting at is that cause and dependence does not establish identity. Remember, as I stated earlier, in order to show that two things are the same, or that to show that consciousness is just something physical, you're going to have to show that they share all the same properties. And more importantly, there are no properties that one has that the other doesn't. So, in other words, merely showing a cause or dependence relationship between two things in question doesn't prove they're the same thing. An example I often use is something like, say I'm the world's greatest guitar player. If you were to give me a guitar with a pop string, let's say that enough strings were popped that I couldn't play the music. Now, this shows that my the way in which I express my musical talent is through the instrument. But if the instrument is damaged to a certain point, I can no longer play the music. So this establishes a cause and effect relationship between the musician and the instrument, but it doesn't prove that, therefore, I am a guitar. Take this a similar line of thought with notes played on a guitar. Let's say I pop enough strings that I can no longer play the note C. Well, it doesn't follow from this that, therefore, the note C is in the guitar, and if I were to break open the guitar, the note C would fall out. Kind of same thing with the piano. I can show you the keys to press to play the note C, but it doesn't follow that these keys are the note C. At best, it establishes a correlation and dependence relationship between playing a musical piece or a note and the instrument needed for that versus stating that they're just the same thing. So if pop strings or broken piano doesn't prove that I am a piano or guitar, or prove that the note C is in a piano or guitar, but then by the same line of reasoning, showing brain damage doesn't prove that the mind is nothing more than the brain. Because again, demonstrating a cause and effect relationship does not establish identity. And usually when people say this, I think to myself, well, first of all, do you think you're the only person to ever come up with this question? Like, do you think in the history of our existence, no one has ever, I mean, it's not as if cavemen didn't know, if I hit you over the head really hard, you're going to get dizzy. In other words, if I hit your head, it's going to affect consciousness. And it's not as if it wasn't until neuroscience came about, we thought, oh, wow, look, when you affect the brain, you affect the mind. No, of course, I mean, that's been known for a long time. And the other question I ask is, do you really think that substance dualism means I deny causation when it comes to the mind and brain? Like, it's really perplexing to me. So yeah, showing a cause and effect relationship doesn't show they're the same thing. It just shows a cause and effect relationship. In fact, to go even further, to say that affecting the brain causes changes in the mind already presupposes two things in question. Why? Because in order for there to be a cause and effect, there has to be at least two, we can say two entities or two events at play. Event or entity X causes Y. If X causes Y, then they can't be the same thing, because if they're the same thing, you're going to say X causes X. But X can't exist in order to cause itself. There has to be something before that to cause it. So in the same sense, if someone's conceding that affecting the brain affects the mind, well, then already they're assuming at least two things in question, which is exactly right in line with the position I'd be arguing.
Now, just some other common objections I hear a lot is that, I mean, yeah, the soul, if it does exist, it's not physical, it's an immaterial. It would be immaterial, right? So, you can't test it in a lab or weigh it or anything like that because it's immaterial. And a lot of times they would agree with me, yeah, if it did exist, then you can't weigh it in a lab or you can't do anything like that. But you should expect to see some physical manifestations of this. And of course, this is a big common one. And Adam Redwine, he's commented this several times, and he wanted to make sure I chime that in as if you haven't responded before. But so how would you respond to that?
Yeah, a few ways. First, I'd say if you're asking to see the physical effects of the soul, I'd have to ask the person, well, first, how would you establish that the physical effects were caused by the soul? In other words, if you're saying, okay, show me the effects of the soul, I can say, okay, well, let me have a thought. I have a thought and there's brain firing, and say, oh, look, there you go. That's the effect of the soul. Of course, the next question is, well, wait a minute, but how do I know that came from a soul? Well, that's exactly the point. Any position that you look to explain the brain firings is going to have to appeal to something that goes beyond any type of empirical investigation, which is why it's said that any views answering these questions are going to be what is called empirically equivalent. Empirically equivalent means that no amount of empirical data is going to be sufficient to lend support to one view over the other. Now, note, sure, there are disagreements among the views, but all these disagreements don't stem from the empirical data. They stem from philosophical presuppositions about the data. So if I think of puppies and candy canes, and this part of my hemisphere lights up and there's neuronal activity, the substance dualist would say, oh, that's the soul causing effects. Property dualists can say, well, there's no soul, but there is something being produced by the brain. And a physicalist will say, no, it's just the brain. None of these three views are going to have any empirical data to prove their philosophical presuppositions or conclusions. This is why we go to metaphysics, not physics. On top of that, you can't use something like empirical investigation or science to investigate something non-physical. Now, if someone's going to go back and say, yes, but show me the manifestation, well, the question is, how do you know that whatever does manifest is in fact a manifestation of the soul? So in other words, it's like saying, weigh the number 2 and tell me what color it is on Wednesday. How many number 2s can you fit in your pocket? To ask physical questions of non-physical entities is to commit a category fallacy. And if you say, okay, well, show me the manifestation, well, I'm not going to be able to show you the manifestation because there's going to be some metaphysical presuppositions I'd have to unpack to show you that any manifestation which occurs is a byproduct or product of the soul itself, which of course, again, is not going to be something physical.
Yeah, I mean, that's great that you pointed that out because it really seems like as I talk with people about this, it really seems they don't have any actual basis for physicalism. It's just that they think that belief in the soul isn't merited, which whenever you do try to present it, they push back with these claims. But it also seems that whenever you try and discuss physicalism or even if you were to weigh in both, it seems that if you were to hold physicalism, a lot of physicalists don't follow their beliefs or they lead, if you get what I'm saying. Like if you try and talk to them about how speaking on identity through change, and you ask them, are you the same person you were, 7 years ago? And they would say, yes. You ask how that is, and you can present that the soul can explain that, and they kind of flip-flop in their view. Would you like to go into that a little further and kind of explain what they do there? Or
Well, I'll tell you the approach that you should take. It's the approach I take, and probably because I'm lazy and I call it the lazy approach. When someone brings up these kind of pretentious objections or dismissals, it's important to note that if they're making a truth claim, then they also bear a burden of proof. Some atheists or skeptics think that as long as I don't make a positive truth claim, like I believe X, as long as I don't make that kind of claim, then I don't have a burden of proof. But that's not the case. If I say I believe X does not exist, that too is a truth claim. It's just a negative truth claim, if you will. And all truth claims bear a burden of proof. So in my discussion I had with T Jump, which you can find on my channel, he kind of tried to take this approach, or it's somewhere along the debate. It's been a year or so now. He said something like, there are no good arguments for the soul. There's no evidence for the soul. And rather than take the bait and jump in and start providing, well, he just made a claim here. So I just step back and say, well, can you please tell me which arguments you've heard? And he's like, well, I don't remember, but, it's been so long, but none of them were good. And I said, well, I understand you think that none of them were good, but, I mean, do you remember at least one or two? And he said, no, it's been a while. I said, okay, that's fine. That's fair. How about this? Can you at least name 2 or 3 books that you've read on the soul? Because given how adamant you are about your disbelief in the soul and claiming that, it's ridiculous to believe in or whatever, then surely someone of your caliber, would have studied these things. So what are two of the top three books on the soul, for or against it? He's like, well, I think he said something like, well, I can't say I've read a book on it. I said, oh, huh. So no arguments, no book. Well, okay. How about this? Can you give me the top scholars who believe in the soul and have done work in it? Couldn't give me that either. In other words, I'm not going to play a game with someone who hasn't even looked seriously into this stuff, where I'm just constantly on a defensive trying to convince them, as if it's my job to convince somebody who all they're going to say is, oh, I don't believe it, or that's not enough. Well, no, you just made a truth claim. Man up, put your big boy pants on and tell me why you think this is such a ridiculous idea. And if you can't give me any, why should I have a serious discussion with you? Why should I take the time to really unpack these things if you yourself haven't looked into it, if you're that genuinely interested in it? And I am talking about Tom Jump here, not Adam Redwine, though it would apply. Well, then by all means, show me that you've done some investigation into this. And 99 times out of 10, I heard Richard Howard say that, they haven't even looked into it or read a book on it or even know the people who are doing work in this. So rather than jump in and start to respond, if someone says there's no evidence for the soul, okay, well, what evidence have you heard? And why did you find it unconvincing? If you were to ask me, do I believe in physicalism? I could say no. And if you were to ask me, well, what are the top books? Who are the scholars? Who are the people who write on that? I can give them to you. I can name them. I can tell you about the different positions and views because I've looked into it. But I'm not going to say this about a subject I've never even read a book on and then just expect the other person to do all the legwork. So, and like you said, there a lot of times people are inconsistent with the view. A lot of times people don't even know their own positions. So rather than jump in and start trying to defend, ask questions. Look at something like Copeland's book and ask questions.
So what I did was because you've already gave certain arguments for the existence of a soul. And I don't want to keep belaboring that, but I posted a couple days ago in an atheist discussion group. I was saying for some objections they would have to the soul, and I knew some of them would be cringy, which they are. But I feel like it'd be a help if we can work through these things because we've already made a positive case and earlier in the video, so I feel like it makes sense for us to address certain negative cases against it. I said objections to the soul, comment them down below. And one atheist said lack of evidence. So would you consider, so I guess they would say, trying to think of how I could phrase this. We gave certain philosophical arguments for the soul. Would you consider that evidence or would you just
Sorry, I was muted. I didn't realize that.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, what? No, yeah. So, no, you don't have to rephrase it. That's exactly what a lot of people usually say. And let me also just preface by saying, we gave like a brief outline and mentioned a few arguments for the soul. I have like a 2.5 hour video on my channel where I talk and go in depth, much more in depth on the soul that people can watch. You could probably put that in the description if you want.
It's in the description.
So, and I was laughing earlier because it's not even an objection. That's more, there's a difference between whiny complaints and actual objections. A complaint is just someone, just that they're complaining about something. An objection is an actual argument. Because people say this even with respect to the existence of God. People say I'm an atheist, and I say, okay, do you have any reasons to believe God does not exist? And they say, well, yeah, there's no evidence. And I say, well, that doesn't prove there's no God. I forget which philosopher came up with this, but, I could say I have no evidence that there's a flea in this room, right? I see no evidence of a flea. But can I conclude from that therefore there is no flea in this room? No, of course not. Me lacking evidence doesn't conclude therefore no flea. You lacking evidence either shows maybe you just haven't found any, or maybe you haven't even looked for it. And that's why I go back to ask people, what books have you read? What scholars can you quote? What are the major arguments about this position? If you can't give me one, then saying there's no evidence doesn't shock me. I forget who it was that said, The reason you can't find evidence for it is the same reason criminals can't find cops. They're not looking for it, or they're trying to avoid it. So yeah, that's not even an objection. And then if someone's going to say, okay, so what's the opposite of the soul? Something like physicalism. What if I said there's no evidence of physicalism? Then what? We just get into a I know you are, but what am I match? I mean, it's just childish.
Yeah, it's not healthy. You don't really get anywhere. So would you say that, like, for example, the argument from identity through change, would you consider that argument an evidence for the soul, or would you say it's a philosophical argument that orders evidences in a methodical manner?
Yeah, I would call it evidence. I would call it
Okay.
a philosophical evidence. I think arguments are evidence. In fact, people say, well, you can't give me arguments as evidence. My response is, well, give me evidence that I can't give you arguments for evidence, because all you gave me was an argument that we can't use arguments for evidence. What's your evidence for the fact that we can't use arguments for evidence? Of course, that's an argument, right? So I think evidence, especially, deductive reasoning, logic, even abduction, are evidences for something. And if someone is going to disagree, well, then I want to hear an objection, not just, a whiny complaint or dismissal about it. Those are a dime a dozen.
Yeah. And again, this is another comment which is pretty much saying the same thing. It says, Hitchens razor, enough said. Which Hitchens razor is whatever is, stated without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, which that claim obviously is stated without evidence. But
right.
But I mean, this is really the same thing. It's just lack of evidence. They're just saying there's lack of evidence. Even after you give a positive case for the existence of a soul, they just say, "Well, there's not enough evidence." Now, I'll just let you get into that. I invited you on this show, so I'll let you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Go ahead. You can speak to it as well. No, I mean, I'd pretty much say the same thing. And I mean, just saying something like Hitchens razor, I would just say, nah, fam.
Yeah.
When people give these like one-liner idiotic remarks,
Yeah.
my response is of the same caliber sometimes, just because I'm not going to waste my time. I say, nah, fam. And what are they going to say? Yes, fam. Okay, we'll just keep saying yes and no until, I guess, the last person who comments wins. I mean, again, I want to hear substantial arguments. And Hitchens razor, it's kind of a play on Occam's razor, but Occam's razor was basically a sort of a tiebreaker, that when you have two competing theories that are equal in evidence or equally accounted for, then you go with which one. And it's more of a general rule of thumb, not really a hard, a hard concrete rule. You go with the one that doesn't posit as many hypotheses or unnecessary hypotheses. So to say Hitchens razor again, which is somewhat stemmed from Occam's razor, I would say, well, what are the evidences for and against? I would always go back to that. What are the evidence for and against? And Hitchens razor is saying that something is asserted without evidence. Now, I can talk for at least 2 hours per my video. So no, you can't say Hitchens razor. You have to respond to 2 hours worth of content. Yeah. And then don't even take my word for it. I'm not even an expert in this field by any means. There have been book links written about this. I've got some here. One of which, I mean, this is a really heavily academic stuff. Blackwell's Companion to Substance Dualism, written by some of the leading world-renowned philosophers and scholars on this topic, who, I mean, let's just say it's definitely not for beginners. And I'm not even saying I understand everything that's written in there. Of course, there's some really heavily academic stuff, but no, you can't just say Hitchens razor as if nothing has been presented for it. I would say don't cut yourself on that razor, because you obviously haven't looked into it.
Yeah. I mean, I was expecting to have like some good actual objections, like things, try to.
Well, that's because you're young and still new to this. The more you learn and live, you see that there are no good objections. There's just complaining, whiny people.
Yeah, I mean, like the other comment that I had was, I have no objections to things that do not exist. And then I commented down below addressing that, and then they said, there's no rational or logical evidence for the existence of a soul. It's not a case of evidence. There's precisely zero evidence to justify anything resembling a soul. It's nonsensical fluff dreamed up by the gullible religious folk. And I think really this is just ignorance. I mean, because I mean,
It's not. It's even less. I mean, it's even worse than that. It's
willing ignorance.
sophistry. It's childness. It's not. It's childish.
Yeah.
Again, and I do this sometimes on my YouTube comment section because,
Yeah.
as you know, if people comment on your videos, YouTube thinks it's an interesting video people want to interact with. So every now and then, if I'm bored or if I'm in line somewhere or taking longer than usual in the bathroom, if you will, I'll pull out my phone and respond to some comments. And if they're dumb comments like that, I'll sometimes respond accordingly. If someone says, "Oh, that's just dumb fluff that people made up," I'll reply with, "Your comment is dumb fluff that people made up." I mean, like,
Yeah, it's just
like
childish games. Yeah, you're not
did
really
that
going
do
anywhere.
anything for you? No. Oh, wow. Well, then you can see how I feel as well. And if someone says, I don't, what was the first thing? Something about evidence for something that doesn't exist.
Oh yeah, they said I don't have. I said I asked what are some objections to the soul, and they said I have no objections to things that don't exist.
Right. So right there, he just made a truth claim. I would say, prove it.
Mm.
Prove what? Prove that the soul doesn't exist. Oh, well, the burden of proof's not on me.
Yeah.
Well, no, but you just made a truth claim. You said it doesn't exist. Prove it, please. And if you can't prove it, then take back your claim. And don't say it doesn't exist. Say you don't believe it exists. But even then, I'd still ask you for, to bear the burden. But don't say it doesn't exist unless you're willing to prove it. And if not, then, stop commenting,
Yeah.
go get a job or something.
Now, I don't think I'm grilling you with questions. I'm just asking you questions because I feel like we've
Please
gave
do.
a positive case as far as, because this video is not going to be like, it's not going to be like the Black Whale's companion. It's just a good introductory video.
Not
And
by any means.
I have his Eric Hernandez's YouTube link down below. So if you want more on that, but what do you think in your, because the soul has been a subject that that you've dealt with for a while, a lot longer than I have. What would you say is the best objection, or I wouldn't say best, the strongest objection against the soul that you've heard?
So you're right in qualifying that maybe not best, but maybe strongest. Yeah. And because I don't know if I could say there are good objections. I think one of the strongest objections, it really just amounts to an argument for ignorance, or probably even perhaps the most popular objection. And again, that's not saying much, calling it the strongest, because it's like saying, who's the smartest, I don't know, 3-year-old? Well, whoever it is, at the end of the day, they're still just a 3-year-old toddler that, can't think about quantum mechanics or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, I think some of the best attempts have been to try and attack the interaction problem. Someone like, gosh, I don't know. I know people like Sean Carroll, which you said you saw the video where I responded to Sean Carroll on the Trinity Radio program with Braxton Hunter, where he tries to show somehow that it's impossible for the soul to interact with the body because it would have to produce X amount of energy, and it would, break some law of the conservation of energy or something like that. But even then, at best, all that would do is, if I were to grant that, which I don't for a second, at best would only show that the soul couldn't interact with the body, but it doesn't show that there would be no soul. So even then, the strongest, best argument isn't even much of an argument or objection. Yeah. Second, when people usually go here, I say they're attacking like the wrong thing. I mean, I don't even know what analogy to use, but if I were, let's say I was trying to show who was the strongest person in the room, and someone said, well, you can't be the strongest person in the room because your shoes are ugly. Well, that wouldn't prove or disprove whether or not the strongest person. I think this is somewhat similar. It's because it's a little bit late. My analogies aren't as good this late at night because my ADHD medicine wears off. But in other words, I don't believe in the soul because I claim to be able to explain and understand the interaction between the soul and body. I believe in the soul for other reasons, and the interaction of the soul and body is a separate question. In other words, even if you were to take that away from me, it was never part of my case to begin with. Yeah. Right. On top of that, I think it's even asking and addressing it's focusing on the wrong issue. because the question of how the soul interacts with the body is an epistemic question, whereas the argument for the soul is an ontological one. I am showing this is how I know the soul exists, and I'm not trying to demonstrate this is how I know the soul works in any type of what we know about it or how, the interactions. Those are two separate questions. So unless the person addresses the ontological inquiry and arguments, they're not going to be able to disprove or prove anything, because asking how it works doesn't, again, prove or disprove it. It's like saying, I don't know how a car works, but I know it exists and I can drive it. It's not as if I have to, learn and go through a mechanic school before I can drive a car. I can drive a car just fine without ever knowing how it works. In the same way, I've been alive for 34 years and I've had a soul for 34 years. Even when I never knew that it existed or how it worked, it was still there to begin with.
Yeah. And that is something I noticed, that as you discuss with atheists, it's never a strong case against, or they don't actually have a positive case for atheism on the soul, or they don't really have a positive, which I'm sure some academic, professors would have a case for physicalism, but a lot of them are just almost an argument from ignorance, where, they always make it sound like they're so much of a better person. Well, me, I am so intellectually honest, I don't believe anything there's not enough evidence for, so I just take the agnostic approach. I mean, even in this is evident in your debate with Aaron Ra, which Aaron Ra, has had a lot of debates, and you would consider him, you would think he had good evidences against the soul. But I think you're giving your analogy. I'm trying to remember what argument you were presenting. It had to do with it was Leibniz's law, the law of identity, argument from identity, where if you can find one thing true of A and it's not true of B, they can't be identical. And you're saying how neurons firing can't be true or false, but you can have a belief that's true or false. And a neuron firing is just a function. To be like, flushing a toilet is a function, but that can't be true or false. And Aaron Ross says, well, yeah, I think flushing a toilet can be true or false. And I'm not trying, I'm trying to think the word, strawman him and say that's his case as a toilet flushing, but it just shows how ignorant some of these arguments are.
No, you were still manning. Yeah, it's. I mean, at some point it stops being funny and it's just kind of pathetic and sad. Yeah. And I know how incredibly patronizing that may sound, but you read off the objections that you were given out loud for yourself. Yeah. There were no objections. There were complaints. There were dismissals. There were, in fact, patronizing, condescending tones. It's really sad, quite frankly. And that's that's why, don't play the game. Put their feet to the fire. Of course, with respect and whatnot. Yeah. But I mean, to just say there's no evidence for the soul. Okay, well, first, there's a difference between good evidence and bad evidence, but saying there's none at all. And if you're going to backpedal and say, okay, there is no good evidence, okay, well, tell me the evidence that you have heard for it, because maybe I might disagree with it too. And I think Aaron brought this up, but I know people in the past have said something like, oh, they try to weigh the soul one time, but that's been debunked. And I said, yeah, I don't know why they would have tried to do it in the first place. That's such a stupid idea, but that wasn't part of my argument. So debunking that doesn't do anything to my case. When I debated Matt Dillahunty, in his opening statement, he said something like, people believe in the soul because, they believe their grandmother after they died sat on the couch and there was a butt print on the couch. Wasn't part of my argument. It's like, what are you reading or looking into? Mm-hmm. And once I find that out, well, no wonder you don't believe in the soul. I wouldn't believe in the soul if I were that, I'm trying to be careful with my words here. If I were that disconnected from the actual arguments and evidence as well, sure, I wouldn't believe it either. Yeah. So I don't blame you, but I do blame you for not looking into this stuff, especially if you're going to publicly say there is no soul, and yet you haven't done your due diligence in it. Shame on you, and rightly so.
Now, there's something I wanted to ask, but of course, right when it's time to ask, I forget. I was going to ask about. Well, I had another question, so maybe I'll think about it as you address this one. Now, for a lot of Christians, they are more trichotomists, which is the belief, that there's the soul, spirit, and body, and that they're kind of co-equal, and that not a substance dualism. Which again, this live stream is more of like a introduction to all this stuff, so we're not going to explain every single definition. So what would your response be to that? Because you would be a substance dualism, and most Christians, I'm sure you'd agree with me, are trichotomists because they believe the Bible teaches a trichotomy because it says the spirit and all that stuff. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say that I don't even know if most Christians know what they would identify as. Now, typically, what is said is that they're trichotomist because the Bible talks about some people usually say it this way, kind of like you said. I'm a trichotomist because I believe in the body, soul, and spirit. And I say, well, so do I. I believe in the body, soul, and spirit too. And they say, well, there you go. Well, time out. Okay, so you believe why? So many ways, body, soul, and spirit. And I say, okay, but do you believe in the mind too? Yeah. Oh, so you're a quadotomist or whatever word, right? No, just three. Well, what about the mind? Well, that's part of maybe the soul. Oh, okay. So you're telling me there can be parts of things that don't make them separate entities. Yes. Okay. Well, that's what I do with the soul and spirit. In other words, I don't deny the spirit. I just say that, put it this way, substance dualism in some instances is basically saying there are two substances. Now, that's not what I'm saying, but for the sake of simplicity, you have a body that exists and then you have a soul that exists. There are two distinct substances, and I'm using air quotes there because I wouldn't call the body a substance itself. Nevertheless, you have the soul and body, and if someone says and a spirit, then my question is, are you saying there are three things at play, three entities? That there's a body, there's a soul, and a spirit? And again, they usually haven't thought about this. So I'll just tell you a discussion I've had. Someone said, there's three things, a body, soul, and spirit. I said, okay, which one are you? They say, what do you mean? I said, well, we both agree that you're not a body, right? Because your body's going to die and you're still going to exist, so you're not your body. So that leaves only two other options. Are you the soul or are you the spirit? And they might say, okay, well, I'm the spirit. Okay. What gets saved, your spirit or your soul? And they might say, well, this one first or that one first or whatever. Or I'll say, well, what talks to God? Does your soul talk to God or your spirit talks to God? My spirit talks to God. Okay, well, what is your soul doing? Is it kind of just chilling there while you're talking to God? And if you're the spirit, then who's the soul guy? Who's that? Because you can't be two different things unless they're grounded in one thing. And if you're the spirit, then what is the soul doing? In other words, I'm trying to get them to think about these things in a different way. Now, here's another approach I take. I ask a trick question, but I don't tell them it's a trick question because I am deceitful like that, and I need prayer. But I say, what taste does your taste? Do your taste buds taste, or do you taste? And sometimes, they say, my taste buds know me. And then after I let them, struggle with an answer for a little bit, I say, well, it was a trick question, because here's what I would say. I would say that I taste through my taste buds. In other words, it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's a I taste through my taste buds, right? I say, okay, now, my view is that I am a soul. I am the captain of the ship, if you will. And my soul, me, am in charge of my body and all the other aspects of myself. Now, I pray to God through my spirit. So it's not as if my spirit is over here praying to God while the soul over here is, just kind of chilling and waiting for its turn. No, much like I taste through my taste buds, the spirit is a faculty of the soul through which I communicate with God. So I talk to God as a soul through my spirit, much like I taste food as a person through my taste buds. So I believe in the spirit, but I believe it's a faculty of the soul, much like, your tongue is a faculty of your body or a member of your body. And I can ask, how many bodies do you have? And they say one. And I say, well, how many hands do you have? They say two. I say, oh, so there's three bodies. No. It's one body and the two hands are part of that body. So you can understand the notion of a whole, relatively speaking, without going into the metaphysics, of a body having other parts to it. In the same line of reasoning, I have a soul that has different compartments, if you will, or faculties. I have a faculty of mind, spirit, various faculties that are grouped together and are grounded in my soul. So I am a soul with a body, and I have faculties that make my soul what it is. And this is what differentiates between a dog soul and a human soul. There are different faculties, different levels of awareness and understanding. So I think for a person to truly be a trichotomist, they're going to have to believe in three different things or substances, and I think that gets into a lot of issues. Because and people say, well, the Bible talks about spirit. Of course it does. It also talks about heart, and it also talks about mind. It also talks about sensations in the stomach. But why stop at 3? Why not go to 4, 5, 6? Well, because oftentimes the Bible is using, and I forget the technical word. I think it starts with the P, but the Bible is using a part to whole kind of language. If I were to say all hands on deck, I'm not saying chop your hands off and throw them on the deck. I'm saying I want your whole body to come on deck, but I'm emphasizing the hands to emphasize what I'm wanting you to do. Namely, I want your labor or service. Hence, I say hands on deck to emphasize the serving or laborious notion of what I'm trying to request. In the same way, when the Bible talks about the soul or spirit or the mind or the heart, it's using a certain aspect of a person to emphasize a point being made. But it's not as if when I say I give my heart to God, I'm saying I'll give you my heart, but my hands and feet, I'm going to hold on to these, okay? But I'll give you my heart. No, it's indicative of making a point, but of course it's still referencing the whole person. It's just using a part to whole type of language.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think most people would say I am a trichotomist, which you're right, they don't. And I feel like that's part of the problem. That's why I wanted to talk about apologetics and the soul, because I feel like they kind of go hand in hand. And a lot of it's just ignorance that a lot of Christians don't have any knowledge at all as far as I mean, we've touched on it already, and it's kind of sad, really. I mean, the question I had that I forgot, which I knew how to remember, is how does belief in a soul get you to God? Because I know that I've talked with some kids, around my age, and I've walked them through certain arguments for the soul, and they would say, yeah, I mean, I guess you're right. It seems that we would have a soul, but how does that get you to God, or why do you need God to explain the soul? Which a soul is an immaterial substance, and it makes sense that there would be immaterial first cause for that substance. But I'll go ahead and let you explain it. I figure you explain it a lot better than I can.
No, I mean, you're basically on the right track. I've heard Moreland say something like, say, okay, if there's no God, then all we have is a purely physical process to explain how we came about, namely through Darwinian evolution, natural selection. And with this, all you have are physical objects coming together to form more complicated physical objects. But at the end of the day, all you're going to get are just that, complicated physical objects. You're not going to get something like an immaterial soul or consciousness squirting into existence. So he says it's kind of like, Moreland says, if you look at a musician, if you look at a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat, you know that he only was able to pull a rabbit out of the hat because the rabbit was always there to begin with. So he didn't pull a rabbit out of nothing. He pulled a rabbit from a hat that was already inside. He says, now, if evolution is true and there's no God, then all you have is a really complicated hat, but you're not going to get a rabbit from the hat, because in order to do that, you have to have a rabbit there in the first place. But if there's no God, there's never going to be a rabbit, a soul, or consciousness there. So you're not going to be able to pull anything out when you reach into it. You're just going to have a really complicated hat. So, kind of like what you said, unless there's a necessary mind, a soul that was there from the beginning to give rise to other minds and souls, well, then you're not going to have one to begin with. And this is why atheists like Thomas Nagel have basically what's the word I'm looking for? Have basically gone to the position of panpsychism, which says, okay, look, consciousness is something weird. It's something not physical. It's something that's not going to arise from just matter rearranging itself through Darwinian evolution. So because we know that we can't get mind from matter, we're going to have to basically say, in other words, you either deny that the mind exists or you say that it's always been there. Well, we can't deny the mind exists because that's just absurd. So we're going to have to say it's always been here, but we can't say that's God because, as Thomas Nagel himself said, I don't want there to be a God. He says, well, let's just say it's always been there from the beginning. And in every piece of matter and everything that's physical and material has latent potential consciousness in it. And it's just a matter of putting it in the right position and arrangement that the consciousness is going to come into, not even come into existence. The consciousness is going to, be unlocked, if you will, but it's always been there, which means anything on my desk, this bottle, this cup has conscious potentiality just kind of dormant in there. And if I put it in the right positions and locations and arrangement, it's going to unlock the consciousness that has always been there to begin with. Now that's just crazy. I've seen, if you Google like panpsychism memes, you're gonna find pictures of like this guy who took these, those little eyes that shake that you can get at the arts and crafts stores. He got those and put them like on his toaster and on his coffee mug, and he's like, "Look, panpsychism is real." And he just put little googly eyes on stuff. But basically, that's what it is. Everything can potentially have actual consciousness. Consciousness being actualized in it because it's already there to begin with. But the point here is this. Here's an atheist who has seriously thought about these issues and is one of the leading philosophers in these areas, has come to the conclusion that because consciousness exists and it cannot be explained through any naturalistic process, we're going to have to bite the bullet in order to avoid God and say it's just always been here. And that is the best attempt I've ever heard from a naturalist. But technically, it's not even a naturalist perspective because now you have this non-natural. It's natural on their view because, well, it's always been here. Well, that doesn't make it natural, just because it's common. But that is the best attempt I've seen. And, like as I've heard Moreland said, God bless him, good luck to him. But it's a valiant attempt.
Yeah. We're coming up at about an hour 30, and I don't want to keep you all night. So I wanted to just allow you to go over anything you think we might have missed or anything you think would be helpful for the audience to know before we go. Is there anything you think we should that we didn't cover would be helpful to cover, or?
No, I think we actually covered quite a bit, and I appreciate the opportunity. Like I said, of course, on my channel, there's about a 2.5-hour video where I'm in a blue shirt. I think it's called like The Cage for the Soul. And then not too long ago, there's a video on there called Unpacking the Soul, where I kind of went a little bit deeper into some of the objections and metaphysics of different things like the origin of the soul, traducianism, something that getting into would just take another at least 5 to 10 minutes just to at least get the concept going. But no, just to reiterate, the 2 points I set out to demonstrate when I provide a case for the soul. One is consciousness and not physical. 2, I am more than a brain and body. And then using Leibniz's law of identity to demonstrate this, which is again a law within logic. So it's, I don't think you can deny that. And that when someone just gives childish, dismissive complaints, you don't have to respond to them because they haven't given you anything to respond to. And don't take the bait and waste your time trying to respond to nonsensical things. Put their feet to the fire and ask them to offer you something substantial.
Okay. And the last thing I wanted to ask you before we go ahead and call it a night is, before we talked about, which I know we touched on this, about apologetics, the importance of it, and why we even take the time, to have a discussion like this on a Friday night when we both could, be doing who knows what, doing something else. So what do you think? Because obviously a lot of Christians are very ignorant on this subject. And if you were to go to most churches, they would not even know what the soul is other than, what do you think the problem is? Why Christians don't have this? Like, why we aren't focused on what's important? Because we all would agree, Christians would agree the soul is important, but why do you think we haven't taken the time to work through our beliefs and know why? Why do you think that we've just, why do you think we become intellectually lazy, or if you get what I'm saying. Like, I'm trying to figure out how I should order this question. Did you kind of get
Yeah.
what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would recommend a book by JP Moreland, go figure, who is my hero. It's my guy, called Loving God with All Your Mind. The Role of Reason in the Life of the Mind, or something like that. Loving God with All Your Mind. And in the book, he goes through the history of what happened historically in the American church, or the Western church, and showed how, to be brief, basically there came this shift of churches that began to overemphasize emotion over intellect in the life of the mind. And this shift basically set the church up for failure and being crippled, to where, because people in the pew couldn't respond to the objections and challenges that were being raised, it's almost as if there was this agreement made between like the universities and the secular community and society and the church, where it's like, and I'm personifying here, where the church said, look, how about this? You keep the intellectual scientific stuff and we'll deal with the emotional heart stuff. So now you have it to where if someone asks a question about life or morality, let's say, in an average American culture, you'll have the news anchor go to the pastor and say, Pastor so-and-so, what do you feel deeply in your heart about this? And they'll say, well, I just believe with all my heart, God bless it. And, he'll tell you what he really believes. And it's like the news anchor's like, oh, that was so sweet. That's so cute. Thank you. And then they go to the next shot, and it's this scientist in a white lab coat. There's like blue water bubbling in the background, so he's legit. And they're like, Dr. So-and-so, what can you tell us that you know about the situation? And he's like, oh, well, we know that. And it's this dichotomy that when it comes to religious beliefs and things like that, you've got opinions and strong feelings and emotions about a subject, but that's all they are, because when it comes to God or religion or theology, there's no knowledge. There's just strongly held beliefs, and whoever's right is the person who bangs the pulpit the hardest. But if you want real knowledge, then you go to a scientist. And rather than correcting this, the church has just continued to run with it, to where, I once had, this Christian said, hey, Eric, this atheist asked me to give him scientific evidence for God. What should I say? And I said, well, you should ask him why you would want to do a silly thing like that. Because God, if he exists, is a non-physical entity. And science, while it's a wonderful tool for studying the physical world, has absolutely nothing to say about the non-physical. It's like using a ruler to measure your weight. But the very fact that someone was asking me, how do I respond to this, as if, oh my gosh, I need an answer here, only shows, well, first of all, you haven't even thought about this that seriously enough to understand that the very question itself is even a category fallacy. It's not even the right question to ask. But again, it's because even the church has felt like, yeah, well, we have our beliefs, but we don't have knowledge. That's what you go to the science for, as if knowledge can't be gained in any other realm but science. Well, that's scientism. That's a whole other discussion. Also another book by Moreland's Scientism and Secularism. But I just go back to saying, or I'll put it this way. As an apologist and being with Texas Baptist, I had the opportunity to go and speak at a lot of churches and visit a lot of places. And there are times where I've gone to certain places where I wasn't speaking, but I was maybe representing Texas Baptist or talking about what we do in apologetics. And I've had people ask, well, what is apologetics? And the best way I've found to answer this is by asking two questions, which I also do when I teach apologetics. I say, look, let's do this. I have two questions. And I want to ask these questions as an atheist or a skeptic. I want to play the role, and you just respond, and we'll do a little role play. And here are the two questions. First question is, why are you a Christian? And the second question is, why should I be a Christian? And what I often get, let's just say the answers aren't really that great. But at one point, when I was talking to someone, I said, well, let me ask you this, as playing the atheist. I said, do you think Christianity is true? And it's like the thought had never occurred to them. Like they had to think about it. But imagine that. I have to ask you if you think Christianity is true, and you have to think about your response. It's kind of, why are you a Christian? Sometimes you have to think about it. Imagine if you asked me, Eric, do you love your wife? And I said, oh, absolutely. And you said, why? And I said, well, man, where to begin? And I can pull out this list. But imagine if you said, Eric, do you love your wife? And I said, let me think about that one. You might say, wow, is everything okay with your marriage? But yeah, this is what I get from a lot of Christians. And again, the thought that is Christianity true never crossed our mind. Now, I've done this with other people, and other people of different religions as well, and I encourage people to do that. Why are you fill in the blank, and why should someone else be a fill in the blank? I was talking to this Muslim young lady. As we're talking, she had this relativistic perspective, and when she told me she was a Muslim, I said, oh, well, I'm a Christian. And I just kind of waited for a response, and her response was, oh, that's great. That's so wonderful. I have a lot of great Christian friends and this and that. And, that's good. I'm like, well, yeah, of course, I'm an apologist. So, I kind of want more than that. And I said something like, how did I say? Basically, what I said was at the end of it, because she kept trying to avoid disagreeing, which of course I wanted a discussion to go. And I said, well, let me ask you this. Do you think I'm wrong? And she said, well, I wouldn't say you're wrong. It's true for you and this and this. And I was trying to get there. So I just flat out said, well, let me ask you this. Do you think Islam is true? And she's like, I've never thought about that. Kind of same thing with Christians. In other words, it's as if in everyone's mind, you can say that you believe that your religion is true. I mean, you can say that you believe your religion, but don't claim that it's true, because that's taking it too far. And I think when it comes to what we do, what we believe, we need to start thinking of it as true, and knowing why it's true, not just thinking of it as, well, this is what makes me a better father or better husband or makes me feel good about myself. None of that matters when it comes to the truth of Christianity. Christianity can be true even if I'm not a good father or husband. I hope to be, but the truth of Christianity is not grounded or predicated on that. It's grounded and predicated in the reality of God's existence and the fact that he rose Jesus from the dead. And we need to teach people this is the foundation of our faith, nothing else.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that when you understand that, it almost empowers you. And by that, I mean, once you understand, wow, what I believe is true, like this is real. It's not just, a hobby. It's not just, something I do that helps me go to sleep at night. It's something that is, if I believe it's true, has certain, I'm trying to think what to say. It almost empowers you. Like if you believe it's true, for example, if Christianity is true, then Jesus really rose from the dead, and we really are sinners. And if we're sinners, we, I mean, everyone has their view on hell, but everyone's a sinner. And if Christianity is true, Jesus came to die on the cross to save you from your sin. I mean, I feel like everything just kind of understanding that Christianity is true, just really for Christians, I feel like it gives you a lot of confidence. And that's why I wanted to have you on the show to help discuss that, as I think it'd help Christians have a more confident faith. And if you want to hear any more on this discussion, and like I said, this discussion was it was more of an introductory type discussion, just so you kind of get people thinking. I have Eric Hernandez's his YouTube channel linked down below. He has many videos and many debates on this subject, and I feel like he's one thing I like about Eric is he's able to grab these principles or truths, and he's able to put it in a form or put it in a way where it's easier to understand. I mean, not to say there's not a lot of content in his videos, there is, but I like the way he orders his thoughts. It's very helpful for me. I know it is for me. And also, if I link down below this book, which I'm sure Eric Hernandez would recommend. It's JP Moreland's book on the soul. I'm currently reading it right now, but JP Moreland's book on the soul is a great introductory book. And I also have that link down below, and I'm sure Eric would recommend it. Yeah. And then also we talked about apologetics and why it's even important to even discuss the soul, why we don't just, have the live stream, have some nice piano music in the background and leave a verse about the soul, why we don't just do that. And it's because, like Eric was saying at the beginning, a lot of Christians don't even have any knowledge of the soul. And if you don't have any knowledge, there's nothing to put your faith into, because faith is trust in or belief in or confidence. And if you don't have anything to grasp onto to put your confidence in, you're really not left with almost wishful thinking, which a lot of atheists would say that's what faith is, but really it's not. Yeah, and that's really what we talked about. So again, if you have any more questions about this or any thoughts, go ahead and check out Eric YouTube channel. And Eric, I appreciate you for coming on and discussing this with me. It's honestly a privilege. It really is.
Privilege is all mine. Thank you. And it's encouraging to see young guys like you doing this. Keep it up.
Yeah. I like to add, like, trying to make this not cheesy, but I'd say that it's possible because of people like you who, take time with us, because us young whippersnappers aren't exactly you take the time to teach us, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Hopefully I'm still a relatively young whippersnapper myself, but we're all one body, and it's an honor and privilege to work together.
Yep.